In this chapter, we develop a model of the economy, and we use what we call an aggregate supply and aggregate demand curve. If you notice, its subtitle is a macroeconomic model for policy analysis, which is what we will use it for. We will study fiscal policy, that's policy undertaken by the federal government. We'll also study monetary policy, that's policy undertaken by the Federal Reserve. This model can show us a relationship between prices and output levels and how we can affect those through policy. The aggregate demand curve is the first one we will take a look at. It shows the relationship between price levels and output levels. It assumes the money supply is fixed. This is important. Therefore, the easiest way to construct it is with the equation of exchange, which is MV equals PY. Now, your book does not do this, and most books don't, but I find this to be the most easily understood way to approach the aggregate demand curve. Makes it very easy to understand why it's downward sloping to the right. First of all, that M stands for money supply. Now, money supply we'll define as check deposits and money outside of banks. We haven't discussed money supply at all, but we will a little bit later when we talk about the Federal Reserve. But obviously it's important. P is the price level, like the price indices we discussed earlier. We talked about the GDP deflator, we talked about the consumer price index. That's what we mean by a price index. So we're not talking about a single price, but a real index of prices to look at the economy. Y is the output level in real terms. It's actually real GDP. And if you look at that for a moment and realize that we're taking the price level times the real GDP, what we have on the right-hand side of that equation is the nominal GDP. So the right-hand side of the equation is nominal GDP. The left-hand side is really the amount of money needed to buy that nominal GDP. The last variable we look at is V. Now, V is an unusual one. We haven't talked about that, and I'll make this as simple as possible. It's called the velocity of money, or how many times a dollar turns over in the economy in a year. What we mean by turnover is how many dollars worth of goods that $1 can buy during the year. So for instance, I go to the market, I spend $1. Somebody then takes that dollar and buys some more goods with it, and then that is spent again and again. So what we mean by that is that it takes less than $1 to buy $1's worth of nominal GDP. So V is relating how many times that turns over to the nominal GDP. We're now going to assume that M is constant and V is constant. That's pretty simple, therefore, because then M times V is a constant, and so the left-hand side is just a number, say 100. Now that makes it pretty easy to understand why P and Y are related in the way they are. Py is now equal to a constant, and if P rises, Y must fall, and if P falls, Y must rise. We can see the aggregate demand curve below in this graph. The vertical axis is the price level, the index we talked about. On the horizontal axis, we have the quantity of output, real GDP, and then we have the aggregate demand curve, which relates these two to each other. If you see, as you can see, as the price level falls, output has to rise. If the price level rises, output has to fall. Nothing else can happen in this case. Now later, a little bit later, we will talk about what will move that curve. Now your book talks about the reasons for the negative slope. I don't think these really explain how we obtain the aggregate demand curve, but they do explain a lot, and I think they are important to note. The first of these is called the real balances effect. This is fairly simple, easy to understand. The other two are a little more complex. What do we mean by real balances? Well, let's assume you have $1,000 in your bank account. If price of goods falls, we can now buy more with that $1,000 than we did before. Remember when we adjusted GDP from nominal to real GDP? Well, this is very similar. Conversely, if prices rise, you can buy less. So if prices go down, you can buy more output, and therefore we will produce more output. If prices go up, you can buy less, and therefore output is going to fall. The next is the interest rate effect. A little more complicated, but not too difficult. What do we mean by the interest rate effect? Well, one of the things we said was that the interest rates affect borrowing, and therefore borrowing affects how much we buy. Well, if prices rise, interest rates are going to rise. This is known as the Fisher effect. So for instance, if the inflation rate goes from 2 to 4%, we're almost certain nominal interest rates are going to rise. So the interest rate effect says that if prices rise, interest rates will rise, we're not going to borrow as much money, and we're not going to buy as many goods. Finally, there's a foreign purchases effect. The foreign purchases effect says that if prices in the United States or any country go down, foreigners will be able to buy those goods more cheaply, and they will buy more of them. So if prices in the United States fall, why is going to rise? Because exports are going to increase. Conversely, if they go up, foreigners are going to buy less, and therefore output is going to decline. What will cause changes in the aggregate demand curve? Well, these should look somewhat familiar, because if you remember, we talked about the determinants of consumption other than income. We said consumption as a function of income, but there were other things that could cause us to consume more or less, as the case may be. Well, that's exactly what this list is right here. And that's what we call the causes of changes in aggregate demand. So anything that will cause consumption to change without an income change is going to affect aggregate demand, just simply because it's going to affect consumption. So what will affect consumer spending? Well, first of all, wealth. We talked about wealth, and we said, well, if you're wealthy and you have a lot of wealth, you probably won't be too concerned about spending a large portion of your current income. So therefore, as wealth increases, consumption increases, and therefore that's going to shift aggregate demand curve to the right. Remember in 2008 when we hit the Great Recession? Well, housing prices fell, stock market went down, therefore people felt less wealthy, and aggregate demand shifted to the left. In other words, consumer spending went down because people felt poor. In fact, they were poor. Also, the borrowing ability. Well, the easier it is to borrow, the more we will buy. The harder it is to borrow, the more difficult it is to buy things. So if borrowing ability becomes important, so therefore if borrowing is easy, it's probably going to increase aggregate demand. And borrowing is both easy and cheap, then that will probably increase aggregate demand because consumption will rise. For instance, zero interest rates on loans on cars is going to increase car sales. I remember many years ago I was working as at a company, and we were selling food plans, and we had to get people get people loans. And the problem was we went into what we call a credit crunch. You couldn't get a loan for anybody. I mean, they had to have impeccable credit, high incomes and everything, and basically my business just tanked. I couldn't get loans for anyone, and therefore I couldn't make any money, and I had to quit. Third are expectations. Expectations are important because they tell us a lot about the optimism or pessimism in the economy. One of the things we talked about some time ago was consumer confidence or consumer sentiment. Those are basically two separate measures, but the same thing. If people feel optimistic about the economy, they're going to tend to consume more. That's going to increase aggregate demand. If they feel pessimistic, they're going to consume less, and that's going to reduce aggregate demand. And finally, there are personal taxes. Well, what do personal taxes do? Well, personal taxes actually reduce our income that we can spend. In other words, if our taxes go up, we have less what we call disposable income. So personal taxes will have an effect on us. So if personal taxes increase, that means aggregate demand is going to go down. If personal taxes decrease, it's going to go up. So these things will cause changes in aggregate demand, and we'll graphically look at this later. When we say an increase in aggregate demand, we're really talking about a shift to the right. A decrease in aggregate demand shifts us to the left. Next, we look at investment. this also can cause changes in aggregate demand. And if you remember, there were two things that determine investment. One, real interest rates, and two, expected returns. First of all, real interest rates. Well, make it simple, real interest rates are the nominal interest rates minus the inflation rate. For instance, let's say you go to the bank and you borrow money at 6% interest. That is your nominal interest rate. But also let's assume that the inflation rate over the year is going to be 2%. That means what you're really borrowing at is 4%, because at the end of the year you're paying it off with cheaper dollars because they are worth 2% less than they did before. So the nominal interest rate is 6%, the inflation rate is 2%, that makes the real interest rate 4%. Right now in today's climate, many real interest rates are actually negative because nominal interest rates are close to zero. For instance, on savings accounts, you get almost nothing, and the inflation rate is actually higher than the interest rate. Second are expected returns. Well, one of the things that determines investment is profits after taxes, expected returns. And there are four things that are going to affect that. First of all, simply expectations, just like with consumers. If you expect a really good economy, when you make projections about your future profits, they're going to look pretty rosy. You're going to think things are going to go very well. Conversely, if you're pessimistic, the economy isn't doing well, you're going to lower those projections quite a bit. And oftentimes, since capital expenditures are made over 10, 15, or 20-year period, things can change dramatically, and therefore we don't know exactly what they're going to be. So when those are made, your expectations about the future have a big impact. So if expectations are very good, that's probably going to increase aggregate demand, going to shift it to the right. If expectations are bad, it's going to shift aggregate demand to the left because investment's going to fall. Second is technology. Technology usually is cost savings and usually increases profits. So normally, improved technology is going to increase aggregate demand. On the other hand, when you don't get a lot of technological changes, then that probably does reduce investment. For instance, quite often today, we don't replace equipment because it's worn out. We replace it because it's obsolete. That means that technology has improved so much, we can't really afford to use the old equipment. So therefore, we buy new. If technology doesn't change, we'll probably keep that equipment longer, and therefore, simply because we're going to wait till it wears out. Third is degree of excess capacity. If you have a factory sitting there that's only half used, that means we have lots of excess capacity. In other words, we can expand output quite a bit without really doing much other than going out and hiring some more workers. On the other hand, if excess capacity is very low, that means in order to expand output, we're going to have to build a new building, add equipment, really make large investments. So when we start approaching capacity limitations, companies are going to have to invest. And in fact, there is a measure of this called the capacity utilization rate, which gives us an estimate of what portion of our investment goods are currently being used. So if excess capacity is high, aggregate demand will probably go down. If excess capacity is low, probably aggregate demand is going to go up. And finally, business taxes. Remember we said that it was all about after-tax profits. So if taxes go up, after-tax profits go down, that is going to reduce aggregate demand for investment. So when taxes rise, it's probably going to shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. If business taxes go down, it's going to shift it to the right. What are the other changes in aggregate demand? Well, one's government spending. Notice here we said government spending, not government consumption, although government consumption is what we measure in GDP. Well, any increase in government spending is going to have an impact on the economy, whether it's a transfer payment or it's a government consumption. On the other hand, what's important is that government consumption has a bigger impact on the economy than transfer payments. We normally assume that with transfer payments we're going to get a situation similar to what we would with cutting taxes. And in fact, oftentimes, transfer payments are simply treated as negative taxes, and we only count government consumption. But government spending, if it increases, will normally increase aggregate demand, shifting it to the right. If government spending goes down, it'll shift it to the left. And finally, net exports. Net exports are simply exports minus imports. If our net exports rise, that's going to shift aggregate demand to the right. If they go down, it's going to shift it to the left. What determines net exports? Well, one's income abroad. This we can't really control. So if foreigners are making a lot of money, they're going to tend to buy more American goods. If it goes down, they're going to buy fewer American goods. Exchange rates also affect it, and there again we have little control over that, or at least the individual does. So if our currency gets very expensive, in other words, the value of the dollar goes up, it's going to make it more difficult for foreigners to buy our goods because they've become relatively more expensive in their currency. If the value of the dollar goes down, it's going to make it easier because it's become relatively cheaper. So when net exports increase, it shifts the aggregate demand curve to the right. When net exports go down, it shifts it to the left. Now, what about aggregate supply? Well, this shows a relationship between price levels and output levels. At low levels of output, the curve is flat. As output rises, it begins to curve upward. At high levels of output, it's vertical, and this can be shown in the next slide. So here again, you don't see a straight line, but you see a curved line with the lower part flat. The intermediate part is beginning to curve upward, and then finally we get to the upper portion, it's vertical. On the vertical axis, we have the price level, and on the horizontal axis, we have level of output, which remember is actually real GDP, and that gives us our aggregate supply curve. Now, your book gives you an explanation of the shape of that curve, which I will give you, but I will also give you my explanation, which I think makes a little bit more sense. All they really do is define the portions of the curve. They say the immediate short run is the time period so short that neither input prices or output prices can change. This is the flat portion of the curve, so that flat part is what they call the immediate short run. The short run is where it begins to curve up, and during this period the output prices can change, but input prices are fixed. This is when the curve starts its upward slope. The reason input prices are fixed is quite often they are tied to contracts which can't be changed for a period of time. For instance, examples like labor contracts. Labor contracts define when wages are going to rise. You get an increase, say, of 2% next year and 3% the next year, et cetera, et cetera. Well, that can't be changed, at least not in the short run. So those kind of input prices are fixed. On the other hand, output prices can change and do very easily. Why? Because there are no long-term contracts in most cases. Then finally, in the long run, this is a period during which both input prices and output prices can change, and that's the vertical portion. So everything can change at that point. Let me give you an alternative explanation, though, that makes, in my mind, a little bit more sense. Simply says at low levels of output, the flat portion, what they call the immediate short run, resources are unemployed. The book calls this, as I said, the immediate short run. What happens here is that companies are operating at very low levels of capacity. They have a lot of excess capacity. Half the factory may be sitting there empty. Well, if you get new orders in, you don't rush to increase your prices, you rush to increase your output. So simply because input prices aren't going to increase. Labor is going to be readily available, a lot of unemployment. Other resources are probably going to be cheap and not rising. So you can therefore buy those resources and then increase output and increase profit without increasing prices. As the economy grows, we get into the upward sloping part of the curve. Some industries are growing and showing signs of working at capacity. Not all industries grow at the same rate. Therefore, some are going to be showing strains of capacity problems before others will. And in those where you have capacity problems, you're going to begin to see some prices rise. Therefore, output prices are rising, and probably input prices are rising too, as they point out. And then finally, the vertical portion is where we have full employment. We can't produce anymore, so the only thing that happens is prices change. For instance, if you want to hire more employees, how do you go about it? You have to offer employees from other companies more money and hire them away. What does that do? That increases your cost, and therefore you're going to have to. So what are the determinants of supply? Well, first of all, there are input prices. These are simply the cost of the inputs that make the product. And whether they are domestic or foreign inputs really makes no difference. So when the cost of domestic inputs rises or the cost of foreign inputs rises, this is going to affect aggregate supply. An increase in these costs is going to shift us to the left. A decrease in these costs will shift us to the right. Second is productivity. Productivity simply means you get more output per worker. This is our measure of productivity. This has an impact on aggregate supply too. So if productivity rises, in other words, the output per worker rises, then the aggregate supply curve shifts to the right. But if productivity declines, it shifts us to the left. Finally, there's a legal and institutional framework that businesses operate under. First of all, there's government regulation. Government regulation is almost always a cost to business. It is going to tend to increase their costs and therefore affect aggregate supply. Thus, an increase in government regulation is going to shift us to the left, but a decrease in government regulation shifts us to the right. Now, obviously, government regulation in some ways is good. Oftentimes, we're told that government regulation is for health and safety reasons. Often, it's politically motivated. So, a lot of government regulation is simply has very little impact on much other than the cost, and therefore has a negative impact on aggregate supply. Measures have shown this to be fairly large. Finally, there are subsidies and taxes. Subsidies are when a business is paid to make something, and taxes is basically when the government takes money because they have made it. Subsidies tend to increase aggregate supply, but taxes tend to reduce aggregate supply. So all of these are what we call the determinants of aggregate supply. Now, what we do in this graph is we combine the aggregate demand curve with the aggregate supply curve. As you can see, I have standard graph, price level vertical, output level horizontal, and we have an aggregate supply curve, which I have drawn, and then we have 4 aggregate demand curves, 81, 82, 83, and 84. Notice as aggregate demand shifts from 81 to 82, output increases and price levels do too. And I might, as I did not point out, the equilibrium is where these two curves are going to intersect. So therefore, when 81 intersects the supply curve, at that point we have a certain price level and certain output level. As 82 shifts, the 81 shifts to 82, then what you see is output levels rise, but price levels don't rise very much. One of the points I might make here is we talked about the multiplier, and this is where you get the largest impact of the multiplier, simply because you're getting all output increases and no price increases. When we shift then to 83, you notice we're in the upward curved part of the aggregate supply curve, and prices are going to begin to rise. Also, output levels will, but prices are, and that's going to reduce the impact of the multiplier. And then finally we get into 84, and notice at this point we get almost no output increases, but we get lots of price increases. Here the multiplier will not affect real output at all, but in fact we'll simply get more output, or higher prices, with little or no output increase. Equilibrium occurs where the aggregate supply and aggregate demand curves intersect. This is shown in the previous slide. As aggregate demand increases, it shifts it to the left. At low levels of output, increases in aggregate demand tend to increase output levels, but not price levels. This is the case where aggregate demand increases from 81 to 82. When the curve shifts to 83, we begin to get some price increases along with some output increases. When the aggregate demand curve shifts to 84, we are at or close to full employment, and at this point we get little or no output increases but lots of price increases. Now let's talk about changes in aggregate supply. Here we've held the aggregate demand curve constant, but we have shifted the aggregate supply curve. And here we get an interesting change of events. When aggregate demand increases, we get both price increases and we get output increases. With changes in aggregate supply, something different happens. So for instance, let's assume that aggregate supply shifts from AS1 to AS2. What that means is that aggregate supply has decreased. You notice at the equilibrium price level has risen, but the output level has fallen. That's a bad situation. That's kind of the worst of all possible worlds. This is one explanation of exactly what happened in the 1970s. We had high price increases, we had inflation, and we had unemployment, which at that point nobody could explain very well. But this does in fact explain it, because what had happened is we instituted lots of government regulation, higher taxes, shifting the aggregate supply curve to the left. If we shift it to the right, we get a situation where price levels fall and output levels rise. This is obviously a much better outcome than the previous one, but we can see that shifting of aggregate supply does in fact impact the economy in a positive way if we shift it to the right. Doesn't if we shift it to the left. Some people have argued this really explains the 1980s, where we got pretty stable prices, but we had huge increases in output levels. In the above slide, we have shown changes in aggregate supply with no change in aggregate demand. As you can see, when the aggregate supply decreases from AS1 to AS2, prices increase but output falls. The worst of both worlds. This explains, again, as I said, what happened in the 1970s. In the aggregate supply increases from AS2 to AS1, we see output increasing and price levels falling, or at least not increasing. In conclusion, we've discussed the development of aggregate supply and aggregate demand curve. We've also explained how shifts in each cause changes in price levels and output levels. And in this model, we can then show the impact of fiscal and monetary policy on the economy.